Frederick Douglass, A Voice for Freedom. Hello and welcome. Today, I'm going to whisper to you about one of the most influential figures in the fight for freedom and equality, Frederick Douglass. Born into the horrors of slavery, Douglass not only freed himself from bondage but also dedicated his life to fighting for the freedom of others. His journey from enslaved child to renowned abolitionist, orator, writer, and statesman is a powerful testament to the human spirit's ability to overcome even the greatest of adversities. Frederick Douglass's story is one of relentless pursuit of knowledge, justice, and equality. His words ignited the flames of change, and his actions laid the groundwork for future generations to continue the struggle for civil rights. Throughout his life, Douglass shattered the stereotypes and misconceptions surrounding African Americans, proving that intellectual strength and eloquence could be wielded as powerful weapons in the fight against oppression. In this journey through Douglass's life, we'll explore the challenges he faced, from his early years in slavery to his rise as one of the most powerful voices in the abolitionist movement. We'll look at his tireless activism during the Civil War, his contributions to the advancement of civil rights after the war, and the lasting legacy he left behind. So, settle in as we take a deep look into the remarkable life of Frederick Douglass, a man who transformed his personal struggle for freedom into a lifelong crusade for justice. From enslavement to freedom, early life and escape. Frederick Douglass was born into the brutal institution of slavery in February 1818 on a plantation in Talbot County, Maryland. His mother, Harriet Bailey, was enslaved, and Frederick was separated from her soon after birth, a common practice designed to weaken family bonds among enslaved people. Douglass spent much of his early childhood in the care of his grandmother, away from the worst realities of slavery, but even then, he was aware of the shadows that would define his life. The harsh world of slavery loomed large over his formative years. When Douglass was around 7 years old, he was taken from his grandmother and sent to live and work at the White House Plantation, one of the largest and most infamous plantations in the region. Here, young Frederick experienced the brutality of slavery firsthand, witnessing beatings and mistreatment on a daily basis. These early experiences shaped his understanding of the injustice and cruelty of the system. Life was a constant struggle, long hours of work, meager food rations, and no formal education were his daily reality. Despite these hardships, Frederick possessed an early, innate sense of resistance. Even as a child, he nurtured a deep desire for something more, a yearning for freedom, though he could not yet fully grasp what that meant. A pivotal change occurred when, at the age of 8, Frederick was sent to Baltimore to live with Hugh and Sophia Auld, relatives of his enslaver. This transition marked a turning point in his life. Baltimore was a bustling port city, offering a different environment from the plantation. It was in the Auld household that Frederick's world began to expand. Sophia Auld, unfamiliar with the brutal customs of slavery, initially treated Frederick with a degree of kindness and began teaching him the alphabet. However, when her husband discovered this, he quickly put a stop to it, claiming that literacy would ruin a slave and make him unfit for servitude. This prohibition only fueled Frederick's determination to learn. Secretly, Frederick continued his education. He watched the white children in his neighborhood and learned from them, trading bits of food for reading lessons. He scavenged discarded newspapers and books, teaching himself to read and write whenever he could. Through reading, Frederick came to understand the broader world and the injustices that defined his existence. He later recalled that learning to read was like opening a door to a new realm of possibilities. His hunger for knowledge grew, as did his desire for freedom. One of the most influential books in young Frederick's life was The Columbian Orator, a collection of speeches on liberty, democracy, and human rights. This book had a profound effect on his thinking, planting the seeds of abolitionism and strengthening his belief that slavery was not only wrong but something that could be fought against and overturned. He realized that knowledge was power and that education could be a path to freedom. At the age of 15, Frederick's life took a darker turn when he was sent to the notorious slave breaker Edward Covey. Covey had a reputation for violently breaking disobedient slaves through fear and physical punishment. The year Frederick spent under Covey's control was one of the most traumatic of his life. Beaten regularly and forced to work in extreme conditions, Douglass was pushed to his physical and emotional limits. Yet, this experience did not destroy him. Instead, it steeled his resolve. One day, in a moment of profound courage, Frederick fought back. In a physical altercation, he resisted Covey's attempts to beat him, and remarkably, Covey backed down. This act of defiance marked a turning point in Frederick's life. He was never physically assaulted by Covey again, and more importantly, he regained a sense of his own power and dignity. Despite this small victory, Frederick remained a slave, but his resolve to escape was stronger than ever. After a failed attempt to flee in 1836, Frederick did not give up. In 1838, at the age of 20, he finally succeeded. Disguised as a sailor and carrying forged papers, Douglass made his daring escape from slavery, traveling from Baltimore to New York City, where he was finally free. The journey was fraught with danger, but Douglass's courage and determination carried him through. Upon reaching New York, Douglass declared, "I have often been asked how I felt when I first found myself on free soil. And my answer is always the same. I felt like one who had escaped a den of hungry lions." His escape marked the beginning of a new chapter in his life, not only as a free man but as a figure who would become a central leader in the abolitionist movement. The personal freedom he had fought so hard to attain would fuel his lifelong mission to end slavery and bring about justice for all those still in chains. The power of literacy, how education transformed Douglass's life. For Frederick Douglass, literacy was not just a tool for learning, it was a path to freedom, both intellectually and physically. His journey into education began under the most unlikely circumstances. The wife of his enslaver, Sophia Auld, in Baltimore, began teaching him the alphabet when he was just a young boy. Though her kindness was rooted in ignorance of the social norms of slavery, it was a gesture that would change Douglass's life forever. But this initial exposure to education was short-lived. Once Hugh Auld, her husband, discovered that Frederick was being taught to read, he put a swift end to it. He warned his wife that teaching a slave to read would ruin him, making him unfit for slavery. For Frederick, this moment was pivotal. It was the first time he fully understood the power of education and why it was kept out of reach for slaves. Hugh Auld's admonition had the opposite effect. It sparked a deep determination in young Douglass to learn. In his autobiography, Douglass would later reflect on this, saying that Auld's words revealed to him the white man's power to enslave the black man. Frederick realized that literacy was a path to empowerment, and he became more determined than ever to pursue his education, even if it meant doing so in secret. Denied formal instruction, Douglass took matters into his own hands. He seized every opportunity to learn, teaching himself to read by observing the white children in the streets of Baltimore. He would often carry a book with him while running errands for the Aulds, practicing reading whenever he could. He cleverly exchanged bread for lessons with local boys, using his limited resources to continue his self-education. The hunger for knowledge consumed him, and despite the severe restrictions placed on him, Frederick found ways to nourish his mind. One of the most important moments in Frederick's self-education came when he discovered a book called The Columbian Orator. This influential collection of speeches and writings on liberty, human rights, and democracy became his guiding light. The book contained powerful speeches by Cicero, George Washington, and others who argue for freedom and justice. One of the speeches that had a profound impact on Douglass was a dialogue between a master and a slave, in which the slave argued for his freedom and won. This story mirrored Frederick's own aspirations, fueling his desire to escape the chains of slavery and seek freedom not just for himself, but for all enslaved people. Through reading, Douglass became acutely aware of the injustice of slavery, and this realization sparked a sense of inner rebellion. He began to understand the broader systems of oppression that kept African Americans in bondage, and he grew increasingly resentful of his circumstances. Knowledge gave him a new sense of identity and purpose. As he devoured more books and writings, he became convinced that slavery was not just a personal tragedy, but a moral evil that had to be eradicated. Frederick's literacy also brought him emotional and psychological freedom. He once described the act of learning to read as both a blessing and a curse. It gave him the ability to see the world for what it was, but it also made him painfully aware of his own enslavement and the cruelty of the system that bound him. In his own words, "I would at times feel that learning to read had been a curse rather than a blessing. It had given me a view of my wretched condition, without the remedy. It opened my eyes to the horrible pit, but to no ladder upon which to get out." Despite the emotional turmoil that his literacy brought, Douglass never gave up on his education. He used his newfound knowledge as a weapon against the institution of slavery. Armed with words, Frederick began to think critically about his situation and the system that perpetuated it. Reading and writing gave him the tools to articulate the deep injustices of slavery, and he knew that this intellectual empowerment would one day lead him to physical freedom. Literacy also became a form of quiet resistance for Frederick. As he honed his reading and writing skills, he would secretly share what he had learned with other enslaved people, teaching them to read in secret Sabbath schools. He knew that the power of knowledge could ignite change, and by helping others gain literacy, he was planting the seeds of resistance within the slave community. This clandestine sharing of knowledge was dangerous. Teaching slaves to read and write was strictly forbidden and could result in severe punishment, but Douglass understood that the risk was worth the reward. The more people who could read, the more people could challenge the institution of slavery. Throughout this period, Frederick was constantly searching for a way to escape slavery. He knew that with his literacy, he would be better equipped to navigate the outside world once he made his escape. He could forge papers, read maps, and communicate with others to aid in his journey to freedom. In 1838, this dream became a reality when Douglass escaped from slavery using the forged papers of a free black sailor. His ability to read and write had played a crucial role in his successful flight to freedom, demonstrating that literacy was not just a personal victory, but a powerful tool for liberation. For Frederick Douglass, literacy was the key that unlocked the door to freedom. His journey from illiteracy to intellectual empowerment is a testament to the transformative power of education. It gave him the tools to not only escape physical bondage but also to challenge the very foundations of the system that enslaved millions of people. The ability to read and write allowed Douglass to become one of the most powerful voices in the abolitionist movement, and it set him on the path to becoming a renowned orator, writer, and leader in the fight for justice. The narrative of Frederick Douglass, writing his resistance. In 1845, Frederick Douglass took a bold step in his fight against slavery by publishing his first autobiography, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave. This book was more than just a personal story. It was an act of defiance and a declaration of his humanity. The narrative exposed the horrors of slavery and revealed the strength and intelligence of a man once considered property. By telling his own story, Douglass reclaimed his identity and used his voice to challenge the system that oppressed him. At the time of its publication, Douglass had already gained attention as a powerful speaker in the abolitionist movement, especially through his work with the American Anti-Slavery Society. His eloquent and passionate speeches captivated audiences across the United States and Europe. However, some doubted the authenticity of his story. People found it hard to believe that a former enslaved person could speak with such intelligence. To silence these doubts, Douglass decided to write his narrative, offering undeniable proof of slavery's evils. The narrative opens with Douglass's early life in Maryland, detailing the brutal conditions he endured as a child enslaved on various plantations. He recounts the physical and emotional abuse he suffered and the daily fear that defined the lives of enslaved people. One of the most powerful moments in the book is his account of the time he spent with Edward Covey, a notorious slave breaker. Covey was tasked with breaking Douglass's spirit, and Douglass describes the relentless beatings and torment he endured. However, after a pivotal moment when Douglass fought back, Covey never laid a hand on him again. Beyond recounting personal experiences, the narrative is a powerful indictment of the institution of slavery. Douglass exposes the hypocrisy of a nation that claims liberty while enslaving millions. He skillfully uses his personal story to reveal the moral contradictions of the United States. He shows how slavery corrupts both the enslaved and the enslaver, stripping people of their humanity. A key theme in the narrative is Douglass's reflection on the role of education. He recounts the moment when Hugh forbade his wife Sophia from teaching Douglass to read, warning that literacy would spoil him. This moment made Douglass realize the true power of knowledge. From then on, he was determined to learn, knowing that literacy would lead to freedom. Education, he believed, was a path to liberation, not only for himself but for all enslaved people. The narrative of Frederick Douglass was an instant success, selling over 30,000 copies in its first 5 years. Its impact was profound, reaching audiences across both the United States and Europe. The book helped galvanize the abolitionist movement, providing an authentic voice for the cause. For many readers, it was their first encounter with a first-hand account of slavery's brutalities, and Douglass's eloquent storytelling made it impossible to ignore. With success, however, came danger. By publishing the narrative, Douglass revealed his identity and the names of his former enslavers, putting him at risk of being captured and returned to slavery. The fugitive slave law still applied, meaning that Douglass, despite his fame, could legally be reclaimed as property. To avoid this fate, Douglass embarked on a 2-year speaking tour in Great Britain and Ireland, where he continued to spread the abolitionist message. During his time abroad, Douglass's stature as an abolitionist leader grew even more. He was warmly received by British audiences, many of whom were already sympathetic to the abolitionist cause. He spoke at numerous events, raising awareness about the plight of enslaved people in the United States. His time in Britain also allowed him to raise enough money to legally purchase his freedom. In 1847, With the help of British supporters, Douglass's emancipation was officially secured, freeing him from the threat of re-enslavement. The success of the narrative marked a turning point in Douglass's life. It solidified his position as a leading figure in the abolitionist movement and established him as a respected writer and intellectual. His ability to articulate the cruelty of slavery, combined with his personal experience, made him a powerful symbol of resistance. The publication of his narrative was just the beginning of his literary career. He would go on to publish 2 more autobiographies, each reflecting on different stages of his life. For Frederick Douglass, writing was a form of resistance. Through his words, he challenged the institution of slavery, exposed its moral failings, and inspired countless others to join the fight for abolition. The narrative of Frederick Douglass remains one of the most important works in American literature, a testament to the power of storytelling in the battle for justice. Speaking out, Douglass's role as an abolitionist orator. As Frederick Douglass gained his freedom, he found his voice as a powerful orator who could captivate and move audiences. His speeches, filled with passion, eloquence, and the weight of his personal experience, made him a key figure in the abolitionist movement. Through his words, Douglass became not just a symbol of the fight for freedom but also a catalyst for change, inspiring others to take up the cause of abolition. After escaping slavery in 1838, Douglass initially sought to live quietly in the North, working as a laborer in New Bedford, Massachusetts. However, his fate changed in 1841 when he attended an anti-slavery convention in Nantucket, where he was invited to speak. Nervous but determined, Douglass stood before the crowd and told the story of his life as an enslaved man. The response was immediate and overwhelming. His natural talent for oratory was undeniable, and his first-hand account of slavery's brutality moved the audience to tears and applause. It was at this moment that Douglass realized the power of his voice. He had a gift for public speaking, and with it, he could do more than just tell his story. He could advocate for the abolition of slavery and for the equality of all people. Douglass's ability to weave personal experience with broader social and political themes made him an incredibly effective speaker. He wasn't just a witness to slavery, he was a living testament to its horrors and the resilience of the human spirit. After his speech in Nantucket, Douglass was invited to join the American Anti-Slavery Society as a full-time lecturer. Working alongside prominent abolitionists such as William Lloyd Garrison and Wendell Phillips, Douglass began traveling across the northern states, delivering speeches that detailed the cruelties of slavery and called for its immediate abolition. His lectures drew large crowds, as people were eager to hear from a man who had lived through the nightmare of enslavement and come out on the other side. One of Douglass's greatest strengths as a speaker was his ability to appeal to the emotions of his audience. He didn't simply recite facts about slavery, he painted vivid pictures of the violence, degradation, and dehumanization that enslaved people endured daily. In one famous speech, Douglass described the sound of a mother's scream as her child was taken from her arms to be sold to another owner. These personal anecdotes had a profound effect on his listeners, forcing them to confront the inhumanity of the system they may have been willing to overlook. Douglass was also skilled at exposing the contradictions in American society. In many of his speeches, he highlighted the hypocrisy of a nation that proclaimed itself the land of liberty while denying basic human rights to millions of African Americans. One of his most famous speeches, delivered on July 5, 1852, was titled "What to the Slave is the 4th of July?" In this scathing address, Douglass asked his predominantly white audience how they could celebrate freedom and independence while slavery still existed. He called out the hypocrisy of celebrating a nation founded on liberty while enslaving millions of people. "This 4th of July is yours, not mine," Douglass declared. "You may rejoice, I must mourn." This speech exemplified Douglass's unique ability to challenge his audience while still engaging them in a broader conversation about freedom, justice, and morality. He didn't shy away from difficult truths, but he also believed in the power of persuasion and reason to change minds. His speeches were not just emotional pleas for freedom, they were also intellectual arguments grounded in moral and ethical principles. Douglass's voice was not only heard in the North, he traveled to Great Britain and Ireland in the mid-1840s to speak about the horrors of slavery. During this time, Douglass found that British audiences were generally more sympathetic to the abolitionist cause than many in America. His eloquent speeches drew large crowds, and he was welcomed with open arms by abolitionist groups in Britain. His time abroad also allowed him to raise funds, which would later be used to secure his legal freedom. Douglass's experience as an orator was not without challenges. As a black man in 19th century America, he faced hostility and threats wherever he spoke. It was not uncommon for his lectures to be interrupted by pro-slavery mobs or for him to be physically assaulted. Despite the risks, Douglass refused to be silenced. He believed that his voice was one of his most powerful tools in the fight for freedom, and he continued to speak out even in the face of danger. Over time, Douglass refined his public speaking style, moving beyond just recounting his personal experiences to addressing broader issues of equality and justice. He became an advocate not only for the abolition of slavery but also for women's rights, racial equality, and education reform. His speeches continued to evolve, reflecting his growing belief that true freedom required more than the end of slavery, it required full equality for all people. Throughout the 1850s, Douglass's role as an orator solidified his position as one of the most prominent abolitionist leaders in the country. His speeches were printed in newspapers, and his reputation as a powerful speaker spread far and wide. He was invited to speak at events across the nation, and his words inspired a new generation of abolitionists to join the cause. In the years leading up to the Civil War, Douglass's speeches took on a more urgent tone. He called for immediate action to end slavery and began to advocate for the use of force if necessary. Douglass believed that the time for compromise had passed and that the nation could no longer delay confronting the evil of slavery. His speeches became rallying cries for abolition, calling on the American people to take a stand and fight for freedom. Douglass in Britain and Ireland, expanding the fight for freedom. Frederick Douglass's time in Britain and Ireland in the mid-1840s marked a critical period of growth in his abolitionist work and his personal journey toward freedom. After publishing his autobiography, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, Douglass quickly rose to prominence in the abolitionist movement. However, with this fame came the danger of being recaptured under the fugitive slave law, which still applied to him. To escape this risk and spread his message to a wider audience, Douglass traveled to Great Britain and Ireland in 1845. When Douglass arrived in Liverpool, he immediately felt a difference in how he was treated compared to his experiences in the United States. In Britain, he was not viewed as inferior due to his race, and he experienced a level of respect and dignity that was rarely afforded to black men in America. Douglass would later write about this, expressing his amazement at how he was treated not as a color, but as a man. This newfound respect allowed Douglass to focus on his abolitionist mission with renewed energy and confidence. Douglass's lectures across England, Scotland, and Ireland were incredibly well received. His ability to speak firsthand about the horrors of slavery captivated British audiences, many of whom were already sympathetic to the abolitionist cause. Douglass's eloquence and personal experience lent authenticity to his speeches, making a powerful impression on those who heard him. His presence in Britain gave a face to the fight against slavery and helped build international support for the movement. In Ireland, Douglass found a particularly strong connection with the people. He arrived during the Great Famine, a time of immense suffering and hardship for the Irish people. Douglass empathized with their struggles, drawing parallels between their fight for freedom from British rule and the plight of enslaved African Americans. The shared sense of oppression created a bond between Douglass and the Irish people, and he formed lasting relationships with key figures in Irish politics, including Daniel O'Connell, a prominent Irish nationalist and abolitionist. O'Connell, known as the Liberator, had long been an advocate for the abolition of slavery, and he and Douglass found common ground in their shared fight for justice and equality. Douglass's time in Ireland was transformative, as he was not only spreading the abolitionist message but also learning from the Irish people's own struggles. His speeches in Dublin, Belfast, and other cities were met with enthusiasm, and his presence helped to galvanize support for the abolitionist cause. The Irish people, facing their own hardships, saw in Douglass a symbol of resilience and resistance against oppression. One of the most significant outcomes of Douglass's time in Britain was the financial support he received to secure his legal freedom. Although he had escaped slavery, Douglass was still legally considered a fugitive in the United States. British supporters of the abolitionist cause were shocked to learn that Douglass, despite his fame, was still at risk of being returned to slavery. Led by Ellen Richardson and other British abolitionists, a group of supporters raised £150 to purchase Douglass's freedom from his former enslaver, Hugh Auld. This act of generosity legally emancipated Douglass, allowing him to return to the United States as a free man and continue his fight for abolition without fear of being recaptured. During his time in Scotland, Douglass became deeply involved in the campaign to pressure the Free Church of Scotland to return money it had received from American slaveholders. The church had accepted donations from wealthy slaveholders in the southern United States, and abolitionists like Douglass argued that this tainted money should be returned. The slogan "Send back the money" became a rallying cry for the movement, and Douglass's speeches on the subject helped raise awareness of the issue. His involvement in this campaign demonstrated his commitment not only to the abolition of slavery in the United States but also to the broader fight for justice and equality around the world. In addition to his public speaking engagements, Douglass's time in Britain and Ireland allowed him to reflect on the broader fight for human rights. He began to see the struggle against slavery as part of a larger global movement for justice, encompassing not only the abolition of slavery but also issues like women's rights and workers' rights. Douglass's time in Britain expanded his understanding of oppression and deepened his commitment to fighting for the rights of all marginalized people. By the time Douglass returned to the United States in 1847, he was a changed man. His experiences in Britain and Ireland had broadened his perspective and strengthened his resolve. He returned not only as a legally free man but also as a more confident and determined leader in the abolitionist movement. His time abroad had given him international connections, financial support, and a renewed sense of purpose. The relationships Douglass built during his time in Britain and Ireland would prove invaluable in his later work. British abolitionists continued to support Douglass and the wider abolitionist cause in the United States, providing both financial assistance and moral support. Douglass's experiences abroad also demonstrated the power of international solidarity in the fight for human rights. He had seen firsthand how the struggle for freedom transcended national borders, and this realization would shape his activism in the years to come. Frederick Douglass's time in Britain and Ireland was a pivotal chapter in his life. It was a period of personal growth, international advocacy, and strengthened commitment to the cause of abolition. The respect and recognition he received abroad allowed him to focus more fully on his work, and the financial support he garnered helped secure his freedom. The North Star, founding his own abolitionist newspaper. In 1847, after returning to the United States as a free man, Frederick Douglass embarked on a new chapter in his fight for abolition by founding his own newspaper, the North Star. This bold move allowed Douglass to amplify his voice and influence, providing a platform to reach even more people with his powerful message. The North Star was not just a tool for spreading abolitionist ideas, it was a vehicle for advocating the broader cause of social justice, including equality for all marginalized groups. The decision to start a newspaper came from Douglass's deep belief in the power of the written word. He understood that education and information were crucial in the fight against slavery, and he wanted to create a publication that would serve as a beacon of truth in a world rife with misinformation and racist propaganda. Naming the paper the North Star was symbolic, as the North Star had long been a guide for enslaved people escaping to freedom in the northern United States and Canada. Douglass's vision for the North Star was ambitious. It was not merely a newspaper for African Americans, it was meant to reach a broad audience, including abolitionists, free black people, and even those who might be swayed to support the cause of abolition. Douglass saw the newspaper as an opportunity to challenge the status quo, to counter pro-slavery narratives, and to provide a platform for voices that were often silenced in mainstream media. Launching the newspaper was a daunting task. Douglass faced significant financial challenges, and he lacked the formal training in journalism that many of his contemporaries had. However, his passion and determination carried him forward. Douglass set up the newspaper's office in Rochester, New York, a city that was known for its abolitionist activity and as a stop on the Underground Railroad. He began the process of building a staff, securing funding, and writing the articles that would define the paper's mission. The North Star debuted on December 3, 1847, and it immediately set itself apart from other abolitionist publications. Douglass's editorial approach was fearless. He was not afraid to criticize both the North and the South for their complicity in slavery. While he condemned the Southern states for their direct involvement in the institution of slavery, he also criticized the Northern states for their apathy and willingness to tolerate the practice. Douglass believed that the entire nation was responsible for the continuation of slavery, and he used the North Star to hold people accountable. The newspaper quickly gained a following, with subscriptions coming in from across the United States and even from Europe. Douglass's writing was passionate, incisive, and uncompromising. He used the North Star to educate his readers about the realities of slavery, exposing the brutality and inhumanity of the system. He also used the platform to address broader issues of social justice, including women's rights, education reform, and racial equality. In this way, Douglass positioned himself not only as an abolitionist but as a champion of human rights. One of the core principles of the North Star was the belief that true freedom and equality could not be achieved without the full inclusion of all marginalized groups in society. Douglass was a strong supporter of women's rights, and he used the newspaper to advocate for women's suffrage alongside the abolition of slavery. He believed that the fight for freedom was interconnected and that one form of oppression could not be dismantled without addressing others. This inclusive approach set the North Star apart from many other abolitionist publications of the time, which often focused exclusively on the issue of slavery without addressing broader social justice concerns. However, running a newspaper was no easy task. Douglass faced numerous obstacles, including financial difficulties, hostility from pro-slavery factions, and the sheer logistical challenges of running a print publication. Despite these challenges, Douglass remained committed to his vision. He poured his energy into writing, editing, and distributing the newspaper, often working long hours with little rest. His dedication paid off, and the North Star became a vital part of the abolitionist movement. Douglass also used the North Star to engage in debates with other prominent figures in the abolitionist movement. He had a complex relationship with his former mentor, William Lloyd Garrison, the editor of The Liberator, another leading abolitionist newspaper. While Douglass greatly respected Garrison and had worked closely with him for years, they disagreed on key issues, including the role of the U.S. Constitution in the fight against slavery. Garrison believed that the Constitution was a pro-slavery document and should be rejected, while Douglass, after careful study, came to see the Constitution as an anti-slavery document that could be used as a tool to fight for freedom. The North Star became a platform for Douglass to articulate his views and to engage in these important debates within the abolitionist community. Despite the challenges, the North Star continued to grow in influence. Douglass's voice reached thousands of readers, and the newspaper became a crucial part of the national conversation on slavery and human rights. Over time, the North Star merged with other abolitionist publications, and in 1851 it was renamed Frederick Douglass Paper. Although the name changed, the mission remained the same, to fight for the abolition of slavery and for the rights of all oppressed people. Douglass's work on the North Star solidified his role as a leader in the abolitionist movement and as one of the most important black voices of the 19th century. Through his writing, he was able to reach people who might not have attended abolitionist meetings or rallies, bringing the message of freedom directly into their homes. His newspaper became a powerful tool for education, advocacy, and change. A new era, Douglass's role in the Civil War. As the United States moved toward the brink of civil war, Frederick Douglass emerged as a vital voice in shaping the national debate on slavery and freedom. His efforts during the Civil War period went beyond advocacy. He became an active participant in influencing the war's course and its ultimate outcome. For Douglass, the Civil War was not just a fight to preserve the Union, but an opportunity to finally end the institution of slavery and secure full rights for African Americans. When war broke out in 1861, Douglass quickly recognized that the conflict between the Union and the Confederacy presented a critical opportunity to end slavery once and for all. From the earliest days of the war, Douglass argued that the Union's success depended on making the abolition of slavery a central goal of the conflict. He believed that the North could not win the war if it did not address the moral evil at the heart of the rebellion, slavery. For Douglass, this war had to be about more than simply preserving the Union, it had to be about freedom. Douglass also saw the war as an opportunity for African Americans to assert their rights and prove their loyalty to the nation. He called for the enlistment of black soldiers in the Union Army, arguing that African Americans had the right and the duty to fight for their own freedom. In his speeches and writings, Douglass urged President Abraham Lincoln and other Union leaders to allow black men to join the fight, declaring, "Who would be free, themselves must strike the blow." He believed that if black men fought for the Union, they would earn their freedom and, hopefully, their place as full citizens of the United States. Douglass's advocacy for black enlistment was not without controversy. Many white Americans, even in the North, were resistant to the idea of arming black men and feared the consequences of doing so. However, Douglass remained steadfast in his belief that African Americans must play an active role in securing their own liberation. He knew that black soldiers could make a significant impact on the outcome of the war and that their contributions would demonstrate their worth to the nation. His persistence paid off when, in 1863, President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which not only declared the freedom of enslaved people in the Confederate States but also allowed for the recruitment of black soldiers into the Union Army. The 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment, one of the first all-black regiments, was formed shortly after, and Douglass's own sons, Lewis and Charles Douglass, enlisted to fight for the Union cause. Douglass proudly supported their decision, knowing that the fight for freedom required personal sacrifice. Douglass was instrumental in recruiting African American men to serve in the Union Army, traveling across the North to deliver speeches and encourage enlistment. His efforts were successful, and by the end of the war, nearly 200,000 black soldiers had served in the Union forces, making a crucial contribution to the North's victory. Douglass viewed these soldiers as heroes, not only for their bravery on the battlefield but for their role in advancing the cause of freedom. Throughout the war, Douglass maintained a complex relationship with President Lincoln. Initially, Douglass was critical of Lincoln's reluctance to take a firm stand on abolition and his hesitation in using the war to address slavery. Douglass was particularly frustrated by Lincoln's early efforts to find compromise solutions that would preserve the Union without immediately ending slavery. However, over time, Douglass came to see Lincoln as an ally in the fight for emancipation, especially after the Emancipation Proclamation was issued. The two men met in person on several occasions, and Douglass used these opportunities to press the president on issues such as equal pay for black soldiers and the treatment of black troops in the Army. Douglass's relationship with Lincoln reached a turning point when Lincoln invited him to the White House in August 1864 to discuss the president's re-election campaign. At the time, Lincoln feared that he might lose the upcoming election and that a new president would seek to end the war without fully abolishing slavery. During their meeting, Lincoln asked Douglass to prepare for the possibility that the war might end before full emancipation was achieved. Lincoln wanted Douglass's help in devising a plan to assist enslaved people in escaping to the North in the event that the war ended without a decisive Union victory. Douglass was struck by the president's sincerity and commitment to the cause of freedom, and he left the meeting with a greater appreciation for Lincoln's leadership. As the war drew to a close in 1865, Douglass reflected on the immense progress that had been made. The Union's victory and the 13th Amendment, which officially abolished slavery, were monumental achievements. Douglass celebrated these victories but also recognized that the fight for equality was far from over. The war had freed millions of enslaved people, but the question of what freedom truly meant remained unresolved. For Douglass, freedom was not just the absence of slavery, it was the full participation of African Americans in the political, economic, and social life of the nation. In the aftermath of the war, Douglass continued to advocate for the rights of African Americans, calling for the passage of laws that would ensure equal treatment under the law, including the right to vote. He believed that the nation's work was far from finished and that the promises of the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment would only be fulfilled if African Americans were granted full citizenship and protection under the Constitution. Post-war activism, the fight for civil rights. With the end of the Civil War in 1865 and the passage of the 13th Amendment, which officially abolished slavery in the United States, Frederick Douglass celebrated a monumental victory. However, Douglass understood that the abolition of slavery was just the beginning. Real freedom meant more than the end of enslavement. It required full citizenship, voting rights, and equality for African Americans. During the Reconstruction era, Douglass fought tirelessly to ensure that the promises of freedom and equality would be realized. He saw the rise of black codes in southern states, designed to restrict the rights of free black people, as a dangerous step backward. He quickly began campaigning for African Americans to be granted full citizenship and the right to vote. In his speeches, Douglass famously stated, "Slavery is not abolished until the black man has the ballot." He believed that without political power, African Americans would remain vulnerable to exploitation. Douglass also played a key role in advocating for the 14th and 15th Amendments. The 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868, granted citizenship to all people born or naturalized in the U.S., including former slaves. The 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870, prohibited voting discrimination based on race. Douglass passionately supported both amendments as essential to securing black Americans' rights. Even with these constitutional protections, Douglass saw continued resistance, especially in the South. The rise of groups like the Ku Klux Klan and the persistence of racial violence troubled Douglass deeply. He spoke out against these injustices, calling on the federal government to protect black citizens from lynching, voter suppression, and other forms of discrimination. Douglass didn't stop with the fight for racial equality. He was also a lifelong advocate for women's rights. He supported women's suffrage and maintained strong relationships with leading suffragists like Susan B. Anthony. Despite tensions between the suffrage and abolition movements, especially after the passage of the 15th Amendment, which granted black men the right to vote but excluded women, Douglass believed that both struggles for equality were interconnected. As the Reconstruction era drew to a close in the late 1870s, Douglass warned against the rollback of progress. The rise of Jim Crow laws and the abandonment of Reconstruction ideals by the federal government deeply concerned him. He believed that the nation risked undoing the advances made during the war. Douglass remained a powerful voice against racial injustice, using every platform available to him to continue the fight for true freedom. Frederick Douglass's post-war activism showed his unyielding dedication to civil rights. Though the Civil War had ended slavery, Douglass knew that the battle for equality was far from over. His efforts laid the groundwork for future generations to continue the struggle for justice, and his legacy as a champion for both racial and gender equality continues to inspire. Diplomatic endeavors, Douglass and Haiti. Frederick Douglass's diplomatic mission to Haiti in 1889 marked a pivotal moment in his illustrious career. Douglass had long admired Haiti, a country that had gained independence from France in 1804 after a successful slave revolt, becoming the first nation to abolish slavery and establish a black republic. For Douglass, Haiti was a symbol of freedom, resistance, and the potential for black leadership. Douglass's appointment as U.S. Minister Resident and Consul General to Haiti by President Benjamin Harrison was not just a recognition of his contributions to the United States, but also a significant moment for U.S. diplomacy. Haiti, the first black republic, had long been marginalized by the international community, and the relationship between the U.S. and Haiti had been tense for much of the 19th century. Haiti's revolutionary origins and black leadership had made it an object of suspicion among Western powers, including the United States. Despite these tensions, the late 1800s saw increasing U.S. interest in expanding its influence in the Caribbean, and Haiti, with its strategic location, was part of that equation. One of the central issues Douglass faced during his time as a diplomat was the United States' desire to lease Mole St. Nicholas, a strategically located port that the U.S. sought to acquire as a naval base. The U.S. government believed that control of the port would help secure American interests in the Caribbean. However, Haitian leaders were reluctant to relinquish control of such a vital asset, and negotiations stalled. Douglass, though representing U.S. interests, sympathized with Haiti's position and understood its desire to maintain control of its own territory. This conflict placed Douglass in a difficult position. On one hand, he was tasked with furthering U.S. foreign policy objectives, but on the other, he held deep respect for Haiti's sovereignty. His moral compass, which had guided his work as an abolitionist and advocate for racial justice, led him to support Haiti's right to self-determination. In the end, the negotiations over Mole St. Nicholas collapsed, and Douglass returned to the United States without securing the naval base for the U.S. However, his time in Haiti was defined by his efforts to improve the relationship between the two countries. He sought to foster a better understanding of Haiti's revolutionary history and its contributions to the global fight for freedom. Douglass often spoke about the parallels between Haiti's fight for independence and the abolitionist movement in the United States, seeing the two struggles as part of a broader narrative of Black liberation. Douglass also worked to dispel the negative stereotypes about Haiti that were prevalent in American society at the time. Many Americans viewed Haiti as a failed state, plagued by political instability and economic hardship. Douglass, however, saw Haiti as a nation that had been forced to navigate immense challenges, including foreign intervention and economic isolation. He used his platform to advocate for greater respect for Haiti's sovereignty and to call for an end to the discriminatory policies that had isolated the country from the international community. During his time in Haiti, Douglass forged a strong relationship with Haitian President Florvil Hippolyte, who had taken power in 1889. Douglass admired Hippolyte's leadership and worked to strengthen the diplomatic ties between Haiti and the United States. Despite the failure of the Mole St. Nicholas negotiations, Douglass believed that Haiti and the U.S. could build a relationship based on mutual respect and shared ideals of freedom and independence. In 1891, after 2 years of service, Douglass resigned from his post as Minister Resident and Consul General. His decision to step down was driven in part by frustration with the U.S. government's handling of the negotiations with Haiti and its lack of support for his diplomatic efforts. Upon his return to the United States, Douglass continued to speak about his experiences in Haiti and to advocate for greater understanding and respect for the country. He remained a vocal supporter of Haiti's sovereignty and used his platform to raise awareness about the challenges the nation faced. Douglass's work in Haiti reflected his broader belief in Pan-Africanism, the idea that people of African descent across the world share a common struggle for freedom and equality. He viewed the liberation of Black people in the United States, Haiti, and elsewhere as interconnected, part of a global fight against oppression. His time in Haiti deepened his understanding of the global dimensions of racial justice and reinforced his belief that the fight for freedom was not limited by national borders. Though Douglass's diplomatic mission to Haiti did not result in the strategic outcomes that the U.S. government had hoped for, it was a powerful symbol of the progress that had been made in the fight for racial equality. As a former enslaved man representing the United States on the international stage, Douglass's appointment as minister to Haiti was a profound statement about the potential for Black leadership in American and global affairs. His work in Haiti, though fraught with challenges, underscored his commitment to diplomacy, education, and moral leadership. In the years following his diplomatic service, Douglass continued to speak about Haiti, using his experiences to highlight the importance of solidarity among oppressed peoples. His time in Haiti was a fitting culmination of his long career, combining his roles as an advocate for Black liberation, a diplomat, and a moral leader. Even in his final years, Douglass remained committed to the cause of freedom, both at home and abroad. The legacy of Frederick Douglass, a lasting influence on civil rights. Frederick Douglass's impact on the course of American history and the global struggle for human rights remains undeniable. Over the course of his lifetime, Douglass transformed from a man born into slavery to one of the most powerful voices for abolition, civil rights, and equality. His legacy, forged through decades of tireless advocacy, continues to inspire movements for freedom and justice today. Douglass's legacy is rooted in his unwavering belief in the power of education, dialogue, and activism. He often credited literacy with opening his eyes to the possibility of freedom. As a young boy, Douglass learned to read secretly, defying the laws that prohibited enslaved people from gaining education. This self-education not only helped him escape the bonds of slavery but also allowed him to communicate his experiences with the world. His writings, particularly his narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, resonated deeply with readers across the globe, challenging them to confront the moral failings of slavery and racism. Douglass's ability to articulate the horrors of slavery and the urgent need for abolition made him a leading figure in the abolitionist movement. He understood that the fight against slavery could not be won through violence alone, it also required changing hearts and minds. As an orator, Douglass captivated audiences with his eloquence and emotional appeals. His speeches, often infused with his personal experiences as a formerly enslaved person, were a powerful tool in rallying support for abolition. His speeches like "What to the Slave is the 4th of July" remain some of the most celebrated and frequently cited works in American political rhetoric, challenging the hypocrisy of a nation built on liberty while enslaving millions of its people. After the Civil War and the abolition of slavery, Douglass did not rest on his laurels. Instead, he continued to push for the full realization of civil rights for African Americans, including the right to vote, access to education, and economic opportunities. Douglass knew that emancipation was not enough if African Americans were still denied their place in American society. He became a vocal advocate for the 14th and 15th Amendments, which granted citizenship and voting rights to African American men. Yet, he also saw that the promises of these amendments were not being fulfilled, particularly as Jim Crow laws and racial segregation took hold in the South. His frustration with the slow progress of Reconstruction and the rise of white supremacy fueled his activism in his later years. Beyond his work in the United States, Douglass was also a fierce advocate for global human rights. His travels to Great Britain, Ireland, and Haiti opened his eyes to the interconnectedness of the struggle for freedom worldwide. He saw the fight for civil rights in the U.S. as part of a larger global movement for justice. His support for Pan-Africanism reflected his belief that the liberation of Black people was not confined to national borders, and he called for unity among people of African descent around the world. Douglass's diplomatic service in Haiti further deepened his commitment to these ideals, as he witnessed firsthand the challenges faced by the first Black republic in navigating a world dominated by imperialist powers. One of the most lasting elements of Douglass's legacy is his insistence on the need for continual struggle. He famously said, "If there is no struggle, there is no progress. This message has resonated across generations of activists who have drawn inspiration from his words and his life's work. From the civil rights movement of the 1960s to the contemporary fight for racial justice, Douglass's words have been invoked by leaders seeking to remind the world that the fight for freedom is ongoing. His belief in the importance of action, rather than passivity, remains a guiding principle for those working to dismantle systems of oppression today. Douglass's commitment to gender equality is another aspect of his legacy that continues to influence modern movements for justice. He was a strong advocate for women's suffrage and believed that true democracy could not exist unless all people, regardless of race or gender, had the right to vote. He worked closely with suffragists like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, advocating for women's rights even as he fought for the rights of African Americans. His willingness to bridge the gap between the abolitionist and women's rights movements set an important precedent for future generations of activists who saw the intersection of various forms of oppression and sought to address them together. In his later years, Douglass continued to use his voice to fight for justice, even as the political landscape of the United States shifted away from the progress made during Reconstruction. He served as a mentor to younger generations of African American leaders, including Ida B. Wells and W.E.B. Du Bois, both of whom continued the fight for civil rights in the 20th century. Douglass's emphasis on education, activism, and resilience became central themes in the work of these future leaders, ensuring that his influence would carry on long after his death. Frederick Douglass passed away in 1895, but his legacy lives on. Statues of Douglass stand in cities across the United States, reminding passers-by of his contributions to the nation's history. His writings and speeches are still widely read and taught, inspiring new generations to continue the work of creating a more just and equal society. Organizations dedicated to civil rights, racial justice, and human rights often draw on Douglass's legacy, invoking his name and his ideas to push for further progress. Today, as the world continues to grapple with issues of racism, inequality, and injustice, Frederick Douglass's words remain as relevant as ever. His life's work serves as a reminder that the struggle for freedom is long and often difficult, but that progress is possible through perseverance, education, and unwavering commitment to justice. Douglass's legacy is not just one of abolition or civil rights. It is the legacy of a man who believed in the power of human dignity, the necessity of freedom, and the responsibility to fight for what is right. And that brings us to the end of Frederick Douglass's incredible journey and his lasting impact on civil rights. His life is a powerful reminder that the fight for justice and equality is never over, and his words continue to inspire us today. Thank you so much for listening and joining me on this exploration of his life and legacy. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe to stay updated with more fascinating historical stories. I'd love to have you as part of this journey, so make sure to follow and hit the notification bell to never miss out on new content. And, of course, feel free to share your thoughts and comments below. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks again, and until next time, take care and keep learning.